Welcome back to the Sports Medicine Orthopod. It's Anthony Yu. I'm here joined by my good buddy, Drew Burleson from Beacon Ortho. We are here to talk about the curious case of Kawhi Leonard's knee injury. Drew, how you doing?
I'm doing good, man. I'm coming to you live from, I guess this won't be live, but I'm coming from the bowels of Great American Ballpark here in Cincinnati, Ohio. So I'm doing really well.
I
The Reds
see
aren't playing
that.
too well right now, but we'll get them next time. There's always
Yeah.
tomorrow.
So we are recording this on Sunday. The show will probably come out later this week. What's the score right now?
It's 8-0 right now, the ninth inning. So unless a furious comeback is about to take place, it's not looking good.
You're telling me there's a chance. What's the food situation like when you're covering a game for a Major League Baseball team?
It's actually fantastic. I mean, we have access to like the players, like cafeteria. So I mean, it's not just like frankfurters and nachos the whole time. I mean, it's really good. It's really good food. I mean, that's probably one of the best things about this is the food.
If it was me, I would just want ballpark nachos endlessly.
There's a lot of games in a season, and that gets old very quickly.
Yeah. So let's jump into it. The story, I think, is pretty well publicized at this point. Let's just go back in time. Kawhi Leonard hurt himself in Game 4 in the playoff series, Clippers versus Jazz. Game the Clippers actually won. And we never saw him after that. If you saw the play, Drew, his knee buckles inward, what we call that valgus moment. Did you see that play? It looked pretty nasty, actually.
Yeah, it did. I mean, again, it's one of those things where you're very concerned just given the mechanism when you see the replay. But I mean, anytime someone can stay in the game and continue to play, it's always promising. But I guess, in his case, it turned out to be more severe than we thought.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he is a cyborg, but if you see a basketball player do that to the knee, you are instantly concerned. And he finished the game and they won, and that's amazing. But we know he didn't finish the series. And in the next round against the Suns, which Clippers ultimately lost, we didn't see him at all. But it wasn't an instantaneous thing like most ACL tears where you find out in the coming days, MRI was done, ACL tear, he's having surgery in a few weeks, case closed. This was a little bit drawn out and mysterious, which, let's be frank, it's Kawhi Leonard. This is just his MO. I think people may recall to the Toronto Raptors title run after they won the championship, his team had to come out and said they didn't really know if he was going to play from game to game. They just would see him in the locker room and he's either going to play or not. And thankfully for the Raptors, he made it through that. But, kind of this mysterious diagnosis cloud, it's not unusual for Kawhi Leonard, and the same was true here. And so as we know now, it turns out he had a partial ACL tear, and that was being floated during these playoff games where it was unclear if he was going to come back or not, that the concern was he had an ACL injury, which matches the mechanism, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah, I mean, it is. It's definitely confusing. I mean, when you think about an ACL, I mean, you have to think about like the anatomy of it. So, I mean, it's a ligament, all right? And you can it can tear in many different ways. Okay, you can have the full thickness tear. I mean, where the whole thing rips apart. That's very easily diagnosed. And again, that's not something you can play with. But again, you can have varying degrees of a sprain of this ligament. So I mean, you could have a very subtle sprain where you just see like a little bit of inflammation in the ligament itself. You could have a higher degree sprain where there's a large portion of it that's torn, but it's overall intact. Or there's also two bundles of the ACL. So these bundles attach individually at different places on the femur bone as well as the shin bone. And sometimes you can have an avulsion of one of those bundles. So again, like you have almost half of it that's torn, but the other half is not torn. So again, my assumption is that he probably had like either a higher grade tear or one of these bundles was completely off of the femur. And that's kind of one of those things where they may have tried to see how he's going to be day to day, but as time was going, they realized that it just was too structurally incompetent to keep playing, and that he was going to do better having surgery on this.
Yeah, so avulsion means torn off the bone. It's a big orthopedic term that big nerd Drew just threw out there. So let's talk about. It's not clear cut. You assume that on the MRI, it's probably read as partial tear, or you see some evidence that the ACL, at least to some degree, is still intact, because a clear rupture is typically pretty well seen on the MRI. MRI is really good at diagnosing an ACL tear, and it's pretty clear cut. And so you would imagine if you saw that, again, the world would have known 1 to 2 days after Game 4 against Utah that he had a complete ACL tear and he was going to have surgery for that. But that's not the case. Shrouded in mystery once again. He's like the international man of mystery and a cyborg. And what's going on in those days and actually what turned out to be weeks while there is this uncertainty whether he's going to play? Like clinically, what is the medical staff trying to figure out?
I think they're trying to see initially how his knee is going to respond to the injury. You know, I mean, is this something that's going to be able to be potentially rehabbed? Because I mean, again, like on your physical exam, there's an exam where you just see how much translation or how much the shin bone moves in relationship to the femur bone. And again, if you have a partial ACL tear, that's going to be pretty normal because again, like the majority of that substance is intact. Like one of the things that you would really love to see is like if you were to get someone to sleep under anesthesia, to assess how much like of rotational instability they have. So you can usually tell a lot about these partial ACL tears once they're under anesthesia and how unstable it is. But I think that probably like the biggest thing is they're in the middle of a playoff run. They think that, you know, they have a chance to win the NBA title this year. So if you have a partial tear, is this thing going to be able to heal a little bit? Is he going to be able to get back and play at all this year? So I think that's probably the stuff they're trying to assess. You know, how much can we get the swelling out of his knee as quickly as possible, get the strength back and get him back to play. And I think that, you know, we were able to see that. Likely they weren't able to do that for whatever, you know, I think the knee just probably wasn't responding. It wasn't feeling right. And again, like these professional athletes are very in tune with their bodies. They know when something is off. So if he senses that there's some type of instability of his knee, I think that's really leaning them towards saying, hey, we got to do something more definitive about this as opposed to just trying to rehab this.
Yeah, and we'll focus on that in a second because that's really the delineating factor that decides between surgery and not surgery is the knee unstable. We've spoken many times on this show, but this is the first time on our fancy YouTube channel that we're going to talk about the ACL. And so remind us, Drew, you mentioned the anatomy a bit, but remind us the function of the ACL. What does it actually do? And when it's compromised, what does that result in?
So it does two main things for the most part. It keeps the knee stable in regards to the shin bone going forward on the femur bone. So anterior translation, we call that, but it also provides a lot of rotational type stability. So people who you need this for, especially that rotational stability, if you're going to do any type of cutting or pivoting, high level sports. I mean, if you're running in a straight line, walking, normal day-to-day stuff, you don't necessarily need an ACL, but, you know, prefer any person who wants to do any sort of athletic activity at all that requires any cutting or pivoting, you need that type of rotational stability of the knee.
Yeah, shin bone going in front of the femur bone. There's some other stabilizing structures in the knee that will help constrain that, but the rotational stability that the ACL confers to the knee, there's not really anything else that will replace that if the ACL is torn. And so that's really what we call the indication, the reason for surgery for an ACL tear is the patient, in this case Kawhi Leonard, unstable? And what would he kind of feel, Drew, like running around without an ACL? What would that instability feel like?
I mean, a lot of people describe this very differently, you know. I mean, so again, like running in a straight line, I mean, like you can do it, that feels fine. Again, I think if you look back to Klay Thompson, I mean, he was able to run back on defense. I mean, you don't need the ACL for that. But again, it's like whenever you start to do those things, those drills where you're doing like cutting, that's when you'll feel the knee kind of buckling or giving out on you. And again, those are the maneuvers that you would be very concerned about if he's trying to do, you know, like shuttle drills or defensive drills or anything like that, and his knee's buckling on him. Again, that's giving you a sign that he's got some instability in the knee and that ACL something needs to be done with it.
And so that's the patient's subjective experience. Do you feel unstable? Which we'll assume yes, because he ended up having surgery. But from the medical staff side, how do we assess that? How do we assess whether the knee is unstable or not? Aside from MRI.
But for him, I think this would be hard because again, like if you have a partial tear, again, like the best exam we have is something called the Lockman exam. Again, where you're basically holding the thigh bone in one hand, and then on the back part of it, and you're holding the shin bone behind that as well, and trying to provide that, moving it towards you and seeing how much laxity you have in there, and then comparing it to the other side. But again, if you have a partial tear, the structure is overall intact. So again, like that rope is intact. But then we have another exam called the pivot shift, where you try to pivot the knee, and you can feel the shin bone kind of reducing onto the thigh bone. But you usually need the patient to be very relaxed to be able to do that. So again, that's a really good exam that we do while they're under anesthesia prior to surgery. But I mean, again, like I think it would be hard. Again, I think that's why there was some mystery clouding this this whole thing, because again, when you have this partial tear from a clinical exam, it's hard to say, you know, how stable or unstable is this, because you're probably not going to get a great exam that's going to show you this is, you know, grossly unstable.
Right. And as you mentioned before, if it was a single bundle tear, not both of the bundles of the ACL will compromise, he might be unstable in one direction, either front to back or rotationally, but stable in the other direction. So it can be confusing. There's something else called arthrometry. It's kind of a lost art, but it's an old school, very old school machine that gives you actually a mathematical number to assess one knee's stability in terms of the ACL versus another. And there are some very simple formulas that you can do to kind of see, hey, is this injured knee compromised in terms of the ACL? Is it unstable versus the kind of normal knee? And I'm sure multiple physical exams were had in Kawhi Leonard, arthrometry as well. You know, he's a high level professional athlete, one of our best. He's going to get as many hands on this knee to see, you know, is there a clear indication this knee is stable or not? And so, you know, long story short, we are going to assume the knee was unstable because he ended up having surgery, and it was reported that it was repaired. Talk to us about ACL repair, why that's probably a misnomer in this case.
Yeah, I mean, I think generically a lot of people say that your ACL is quote unquote repaired. What the difference between a repair and what we typically call a reconstruction is that a repair is whenever you take the ligament that you already have, the native ligament, and you put some sutures in it and affix it back to the area that it came off of with some device, either like a drill tunnel that you tie the sutures that you repaired the ligament with, or we have these things called suture anchors. So if anybody's ever put pictures up into drywall and you need to like screw, the screw just keeps falling on the drywall. Sometimes people use these anchors into drywall to provide more pull-out strength of that screw, so you can hang a heavy object on there. Now, anchors that we use in surgery are just like that, but they have little sutures that go through the anchor itself. So again, sometimes we'll fix things with a suture anchor with suture going into the ligament. But when we typically do like an ACL surgery, we do something called a reconstruction, where we take graft tissue from some other part of the body. So sometimes we take tissue from the patient's own body, sometimes we take cadaver tissue, but you take other tissue and you recreate a ligament and you put it back into the proper position with the use of, again, you fix it various different ways, but usually drill some tunnels in the bone and fix it back into place with different means. Yeah,
so repair kind of indicates we're sewing it together in some way, maybe with the use of anchors or something. Why don't we do that, Drew? Why isn't that the standard treatment?
It's somewhat controversial, to be honest with you. I mean, like I think there are some people who do a lot of repairs, like especially for partial ACLs like this. But there's been studies done in the past looking at, you know, repair versus reconstruction, and the reconstruction typically in the historical literature has a lot higher failure rate. Some people will argue that that's
repair has.
Yeah, repair has if I said reconstruction, I misspoke. But yeah, repair has a higher failure rate than a reconstruction. And some people will speculate that that's because the studies that were done previously, again, they weren't selective at all about the injuries that they repaired. So no matter what happened, they tried to repair it. So there are some ACL tears that some people will argue that are very amenable to a repair. Again, so fixing it with the native ligament. There are some people who think that no matter what, if you're going to do a surgery, that the reconstruction is a lot more reliable treatment option, and will just, even if there's a partial tear or something that somebody else may think could be repaired, they will reconstruct it or use another type of tissue.
Yeah, and so I think, you know, generally speaking, we would consider ACL reconstruction the replacement of the ACL, the native ACL, with a graft that then serves as the new ACL, to be the gold standard treatment for an ACL tear. Repair, as you said, controversial. And so, you know, we don't like to speculate on the show much, but most likely Kawhi Leonard is getting an ACL reconstruction, correct?
Given the fact that I trained with the guy who did the surgery, and knowing him, I would bet anything that he got a reconstruction. Yes.
Yeah. And so a lot's being made right now about his impending, Kawhi Leonard, not your mentor, his impending contract situation and what's he going to do. Is it going to end up in the Warriors? Dream scenario for me. But what's next year look like if he in fact had ACL reconstruction, which is highly likely in this case?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see him playing this next year. I think it'd be very tough. Again, we talked about this on the show before. I mean, you're looking 9 months at the absolute earliest. So, having surgery June, I mean, so that making that 9 months from then, I mean, and again, obviously knowing Kawhi and how he recovers from injury. I mean, again, like he's very a big believer in load management and making sure that he's completely ready. So I don't see. It'd be a very slim scenario where he would come back and play next year. I see him coming back the year afterwards.
Yeah, it's probably going to be a similar to Kevin Durant type situation where whichever team signs him next, whether he goes back to the Clippers or some other team, you're just sinking that cost into next year as an investment for future payoff in years to come. Anyway, yeah, so mysterious situation. I think you and I talked during the saga that most likely it was going to end up with ACL reconstruction, and here's where we are. Any parting thoughts on this? Yet once more, another mysterious saga for a Kawhi Leonard injury.
I mean, a very mysterious injury for a very mysterious type of person. I mean,
Yeah.
I think there's that one, the interview where him laughing at him. I think that's the most personality we've ever seen out of him before. So yeah, he's a mysterious person. I mean, I wouldn't expect anything different, any type of injury than this from him.
Absolutely. All right, Drew. Well, thanks for coming on. What's going on in the game? Is it over?
I think it's over. I'm not sure, but what I'm hearing outside, it sounds like the TVs are off and the game's over.
All right. Well, great thing about baseball is you live to play another day, which is usually the next day.
Got one tomorrow.
Yeah. All right, Drew. Good to see you. Welcome to YouTube. Thanks for listening, everyone. Hey, folks. Thanks for tuning in. If you like the show, please subscribe, like, and share. And we'd love to hear from you. If you have a question about today's show, or you, a loved one, or maybe your favorite athlete has sustained a sports medicine injury that you would like to know more about, please reach out to us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or email. And stay tuned for more exciting content from the Sports Medicine Orthopod. Thanks again.